This is a project that's been on the drawing board for quite some time, and a friend of mine who's a chemistry teacher at a local school basically got sick of the ball and stick models, and he was suggesting that maybe I could mould some kind of plastic pieces which would just be a two-dimensional version and would be a little bit cheaper and a little bit easier to use. And what he was suggesting is maybe just a straightforward 2D shape, but with some magnets embedded in so that they click together, which makes it very easy for the students to assemble chemical models. And although you can put magnets into plastic parts, these are some of the light switches that I did a few years ago. These are capacitive touch light switch modules, and to make these easy to assemble, the backboard, which goes onto your box on the wall, has magnets embedded behind it, and then the actual panel itself with the circuit board has magnets on the other side. And you can get away in aluminium moulds at least by putting magnets in fairly easily. You can either just glue them into the aluminium itself, because obviously this is non-ferrous so it doesn't interfere with the magnetism, or you can embed them from behind. I think in the end on this I actually put some pins in just to create the holes I needed, and then we got self-adhesive magnets in the end and stuck them in that way. But there's no reason why you couldn't mould magnets straight into the plastic, kind of like was being suggested, but trying to come up with all of the different permutations of how various elements combine together, and you've only got a north and south polarity. It would make sense obviously to have the positive ions with possibly a north pole and the negative ions with a south pole, and then for the oddball ones you can possibly put just a plain piece of steel in here, either a washer or a nut, and then they would still click together. But I thought you might run into some issues with that. It's also a little fiddly putting the magnets into the mould. They're not very expensive. You can buy them in bulk from China, little neodymium magnets for pennies. But you've also got a problem, of course, with recycling any scrap, because you would have to pick all of the magnets out before you put them through the granulator. So another alternative that we looked at was maybe to do a kind of puzzle kind of configuration where you actually have slots in some of the molecules and little teeth protruding on some of the others. I'm not drawing this terribly well. And then they would click together quite easily, but you would run into a problem, of course, if I wanted to tag an oxygen on here. Then I'm going to have a problem, because I would need a bridge piece here just to fill in the gaps. Maybe you could make a feature of that, but I wasn't 100% convinced. So that was the original concept that we were looking at. And then it got put to one side for a while, and it occurred to me that actually there might be a better way of doing it, which is to make some rubber stamps. And I had a go at doing this a few years ago, long before I knew what I was doing, so that's a horribly flashed set of stamps. One of my uncles actually was doing car boot sales at the time, and that's a horrible short shot, and he noticed some people were selling various stamps and the kids seemed to like them, so he said, can't you mould those? So I tried various materials I had in stock, and I found this Santoprene material worked pretty well, and I was just using these drawer handles as a handle for them. If I stamp that on some ink, it seems to work reasonably well. I found another material that worked was a TPE. This is a SEBS, styrene, ethylene, butylene, styrene, bit of a mouthful, and this also picks up ink. So that's an alternative solution. So that would be doable, but the problem with this is if you tried to mould these with the wings on, you would obviously need for a carbon 4 little wings, and then you've obviously got to match up another stamp perfectly with that. So if I came up here and I was slightly out, my bonds aren't going to meet. So that led me to conclude that what I really need is an octagonal stamp, and that way, I badly draw an octagon, and that way all of my bonds would actually line up with the edges. So as long as the stamp came square up to the previous impression, you could actually daisy chain these along and it would work reasonably well. I looked at what might be involved in doing that, and looked at possibly just moulding loads of small stamps like this and then sticking them on some kind of handle, but I really wanted an octagonal handle, which kind of precludes using these. So I was looking at maybe I can get some wood and cut it all down to an octagonal shape, chop them up, stick them on, but that starts getting rather complicated, and plus I'd need quite a lot of these things, so I wasn't completely convinced by that. I looked around to see if there was anything out there that might already do the job, and the closest I could get were these, which is a 26 letter stamp assortment. I think I paid about £3 for that. And these are actually quite cool. They look like there's a lot of ink in there, but actually it's just the foam pad at the end of the day. That's about 1 millimetre deep. But they're self-inking and they work reasonably well if I get them the right way round. And you can see the alignment issue immediately with that. And although there's a lot of standard letters available, so we can do a methane there for example, but obviously it's not got all of the chemical elements that you might actually want to do, plus you'd have to draw in your own circles around them and put in the bonds. It's not the end of the world, I suppose. You can get these custom made, but they are quite expensive actually. Presumably they have to make a mould for these, and I thought, well, maybe there's a way of doing that myself. And what I came up with was these little felt pads. These are just feet, basically, self-adhesive felt feet, but these are synthetic felt, these aren't wool, and as a result you can actually burn into the material to leave an impression. So on that one I can do things like that, and the other end, well, I've just put a couple of tram lines. So it's not particularly convincing, but maybe if you loaded the felt with ink beforehand you could make your own self-inking stamp. I don't think it'd be as good as these foam ones that they're obviously producing in China, but I couldn't figure out exactly how I would make these. It needs to be an open cell foam so that the ink can run through. But that was an idea that I looked at, but I didn't get too far on that one either. So in the end I came back to let's have a go at moulding them, and I looked at possible ways of making different rubber stamps, kind of the same size as this. One issue that these have is that would actually cost £3 to post in the UK, because it's over 25 millimetres, and as soon as you go above a 25 millimetre size you're into parcel rates. You can go up to, you know, fair size like this and it classes as a large letter in the UK, and second class is 88 pence at the moment. I think first class is about £1.15. But it has to be below 25 millimetres, so that's a non-starter. But obviously if I did a slightly smaller version, just the size of this thimble on the end, that would fit and keep postal costs down if anybody wanted to buy these. So I had a look at what the minimum I could get away with was, and consulting my teacher friend, he suggested you just need maybe a dozen different elements plus a blank for doing the oddball ones. And looking at this, it's different ways. You could mould something and put a cap on it, or you can make some parts and over mould it, because these synthetic rubbers can be quite expensive, whereas polypropylene or polyethylene that they've used here is probably polypropylene. That's a fairly cheap material, but you would have to do a lot of over moulding, and even though I might only need 12 of these, it's still a lot of fiddling around. Plus ideally I would want to colour code these because there is a standard colour scheme, the CPK colour scheme. So these are how it should be done. Carbons are obviously black. Hydrogen should be white, and that's going to be awkward because white ink isn't really going to show up too well. Oxygen's red, your halogens and your alkaline earth metals are green, phosphorus is orange, sulfur is yellow, nitrogen is blue, and then alkaline metals, calcium, potassium and sodium, they're purple. So there's quite a few different colours here. But then somebody suggested that rather than doing it that way, maybe we just concentrate on the actual bond shape, and then you can write your own element symbols in them. And if you do it this way, it simplifies things enormously, because you can have, you know, 5 different elements just with one stamp. And again here we can do quite a lot of elements with one stamp, so it cuts down on the permutations that I would actually need for doing this. And then I thought about simplifying it even further, and although I've got these oddball ones with the purples and the yellows and the greens, if we forget about the green, well, the purple is fairly close to the blue, so we could dump the purple there, and likewise here, if I did the phosphorus in blue instead of purple, that gets rid of that colour. And the sulphur should be yellow, but red is not a million miles out. And so doing it this way, I can get pretty much everything that I want out of just 3 colours, and these are fairly standard ink colours as well. I mean, you can get all different coloured inks, but ink pads can be quite expensive. I was looking around recently and they're sort of £1.50 to £2 each. So the more you have, the more expensive this kit is going to get. So limiting it to just 3 colours seems a fairly logical way to go, unless teachers are adamant that we have to stick to the full CPK complement. So that's where I'm at the moment, and what I'm looking at doing is basically moulding a thimble about that size. I'll make the whole thing out of one of these rubbers. The Santoprene I only have in this dark material in a soft enough grade. I haven't been able to find any that's suitable, but the TPE I do have in clear, so this stuff I could mould in all the different colours that I want. So one thing is I'll make 4 different moulds and run each 3 different moulds each with 4 of these different elements on, and then run each set of moulds in a different colour, and that gives me my full complement, and they're small enough to fit in a postal pack, which will go out fairly cheap. So I've chopped some metal down already, and the basic idea is I'm going to have a top plate with a feed, and then I'm going to have 2 plates here, and because this is all going to be tapered, the idea is when these moulds separate, these will slide out nice and easily. And then on the base, and I've already cut one of the bases here just to see what it would look like. Didn't bother filming it because it's basically just a series of holes. So I've got quite a lot of magnets here because this is going to be all floating on the moving half, so there's going to be quite a bit of weight on there. So I'm hoping that just a couple of guide pins plus a load of magnets will hold it in place and stop it bouncing off. And then the impression itself is just a 1mm slot drill gone down 1mm, and that will be at the base of our thimble. So this I only need 1 of. This will just be drilled through in 4 places and then tapered. And then these I need 3 sets of 2, 1 for the bottom, 1 for the top. On the top I've decided, instead of having the same impression, I'm going to have this domed, which you can see here. There's a little ball nose cut at the bottom there, and that's just so that you can differentiate between the top and the bottom. Kids are probably going to go and put ink on the bottom and on the top anyway, but I'm trying to mitigate that as much as possible. So the top plate is going to look the same as this, obviously mirrored, with a ball nose cut and a feed in the centre, and then this is simply going to be 4 thimbles cut through in 2 parts, so the whole thing separates and comes out. So that's my plan, and on the back of that I should be able to get quite creative. So although these are done with the proper CPK colour scheme, this is an idea of some of the compounds that should be relatively easy to stamp out with this. We're not going to have the letters, they're going to have to be added by the students or whoever else is using this, the teachers, but you should be able to cover pretty much everything that is on a standard chemistry curriculum, and it's going to be a lot quicker and easier than using the ball and stick models. And the good thing about this is because they're stamps, you should be able to put these in your exercise book and go away with a permanent copy of what you've actually done in the class. That's another issue on the size. I'd like these to be as big as possible for utility purposes, but on the other hand I don't want the stamps far too big. I mean, if they're starting to get over 1 inch size, you're going to run out of room in your book very quickly once you start doing some of the larger compounds. So I've made a start on this already and done this bottom plate. Next step, I'm going to drill this out, and this one needs a little bit more care and consideration because these have got to align pretty well, but essentially it's just drilling some holes and then going around to create some tapering. And then with a bit of luck, and I'm also going to need a dummy one of these to balance out the machine when it clamps, so I need a blank set, but I can use the unused sets of face plates because I'm only going to be using one of these at a time, and I'll have 3 sets. So I need a second one of these, but not with the cavities cut in them, just with the bolt holes and the magnets. And then in theory that should allow me to make a complete set of 12 of these, and then we can see if it's actually any good, hand them over to the teacher who's been waiting for these for 2 or 3 years now. I did say it would be a fairly easy project, but once you get into the detail there are ways and ways, and I've never really been happy with a solution until now. So that's where we're at. Made a start, do these and see how it goes.